Okay, well, for all of you who are out there, thank you very much for joining us today for our presentation on environmental, social, and corporate governance matters and green loans. We're hopeful that in the next hour, we'll be able to bring you some highlights of current considerations in legal matters for ESG, as well as the potential opportunities that contemporary considerations of these issues afford. Many current discussions of ESG frame this group of issues as perhaps with a note of caution, or perhaps as one more item that companies or boards of directors or senior management need to take into consideration. But we also want to share with you the opportunities that are now emerging in the marketplace, concrete opportunities, including those that may have a positive impact on the bottom line of your company or your clients' companies, so that we see ESG as not just another duty or another obligation, but a welcome addition to the corporate marketplace. We have a very strong panel joining us today who will be working through these issues in a discussion format. Please feel free at any time to join our discussion by asking questions at any time using the Q&A box. The raise hand and chat box submissions are disabled even if they appear on your screen. We'll be pleased to make this discussion interactive by taking your questions as they come, and of course, at the end, there will also be time for discussions. Our panelists are John Uren. He's Head Sustainable Finance, Products and Strategy at Bank of Montreal. He leads product development and strategic initiatives across the enterprise, including raising capital and providing sustainable finance opportunities to clients. John is also a member of the CSA's group's Transition and Sustainable Finance Technical Committee. Prior to joining the Sustainable Finance team, John was Senior Counsel and Director in Capital Markets Legal at BMO. In 2017, he was one of Lexpert's Rising Star Award winners as a top lawyer under 40. Paulina Cursa is a Senior Director in Corporate Finance at Bank of Montreal and works with a number of mid to large private and public companies to provide an integrated suite of banking solutions. She has over 12 years of extensive corporate and commercial banking lending experience, which span various industries and includes structuring and executing single bank underwritten, as well as syndicated loan transactions. She's viewed as being a key relationship partner for clients by providing trusted guidance and expertise to help drive business growth. Stephen Pike is a business law and ESG partner at Gowling WLG and is a senior advisor to global and Canadian businesses. He advises on corporate law and corporate governance, sustainability and ESG issues, as well as risk management and product distribution related issues. He's a frequent writer and speaker on ESG issues, including on an ongoing series entitled Insights for Canadian CEOs and Directors on Addressing Modern Slavery in Their Businesses and Supply Chains. He's Vice Chair of the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee of the American Bar Association Business Law Section, and is co-editor of the upcoming book, Governance Meets Sustainability, a guidebook for directors, which will be published in October by the American Bar Association. My name is Chris Allen, and I'm the national head of our lending practice at Gowling WLG in Canada. I'll start by framing this discussion with a couple of examples of where we see some legal issues or some concrete legal statutory issues developing. Very recently, in the early days of the Biden administration, the interconnectedness of climate change and ESG issues has come forward. We've seen the US Securities and Exchange Commission announce the creation of a climate and ESG task force to develop initiatives to proactively identify ESG-related misconduct and to look at material gaps or misstatements in the disclosure of climate risks. The SEC has raised the concept of creating a universal reporting framework, and the chair of the SEC has noted that it's time to begin to take critical steps towards a comprehensive ESG disclosure framework. This goes hand in hand with other departments in the United States, like the Department of Labor, that is considering what rules should be applied from the prior administration versus the current administration in order to make ESG important factors in governance matters. In Canada, back in 2019, if we think about the rules that govern the governance of directors, we know that every officer and director of a corporation, in exercising their powers and discharging their duties under the Canada Business Corporations Act, must act honestly and in good faith with a view to the best interests of the corporation, which has often in the past been a singular focus on the value given to shareholders. In 2019, those duties were modified to note that directors and officers may, in carrying out those duties, consider a number of factors, which included employees, consumers, governments, and the environment. While these don't appear to be mandatory factors, I think both of these developments are examples of how governments are moving to codify ESG as an important framework inside the governance of companies. But now let's begin from hearing the experts about the challenges and opportunities that ESG affords, and I'll turn it over to Paulina to kick us off with our first discussion point.
Thank you, Chris and Kathleen, for hosting us today. This is an incredibly important and topical conversation for our respective organizations, and one that comes up often in discussion with our clients. So let's turn it over to Stephen and John, who I know everybody's very eager to hear from. So Stephen, let's start with you. What is ESG? How do you define it, and why should businesses care?
Well, thanks, Paulina, and thanks, Chris, for that warm introduction. There isn't a specific legal definition of ESG, so I'm going to give you my definition of ESG. In terms of the E, I would describe that as the business's impact on the environment and its use of resources and energy. As far as the S is the business's relationship with people, both inside the business and the business's value chains, and outside, including the communities in which the business operates and society at large. In terms of the G, well, that's how the business is run, from corporate governance at the board level to the boots on the ground mapping supply chains in Asia and Africa. And these ESG factors, they can be objective and subjective, they can be qualitative and quantitative, domestic or global, they can be bespoke to a business or industry-wide or right across a whole geographic area. These are the drivers of decision-making, of risk assessment and capital allocation. And it's very important to remember that they're not siloed and not independent. They're interconnected and frankly, they're interactive. But at the center of any discussion or definition of ESG, we have to find the business's stakeholders. And as Chris had mentioned, under Canada Business Corporations Act, but also in terms of the definition or meaning set out by the Supreme Court of Canada in cases several years ago. Those stakeholders include shareholders, employees, creditors, consumers, government, suppliers, the environment. And so why should businesses care? Businesses should care about ESG because stakeholders care. And as we're seeing more and more, literally on a daily basis, stakeholders are exerting pressures on businesses to deal with ESG issues. So that's my take on what ESG means.
And maybe I'll jump in, Stephen. I think that was really good, and I completely agree. It's about looking across the spectrum or value chain of a company and understanding what's most relevant to stakeholders. But I think it's important to point out, like, ESG factors or issues, it's not like, businesses are just waking up to ESG today and saying, oh my goodness, we have to start thinking about these risks, right? I mean, historically, companies have always cared about environmental risks and, understanding, what a risk like an oil spill could mean to their bottom line, or, drought or flooding or other environmental issues, social issues like supply chain interruptions and from a governance perspective, thinking about things, there's probably 1,000 management books that have been written about sort of optimizing management and governance structures. So it's not like these topics are new, but what is new is really the extent to which investors, customers, regulators, lenders, stakeholders are looking at these ESG factors and really thinking about how a company is addressing them and doing it thoughtfully. And, investors have sort of led this traditionally, or at least in the last 10 or 15 years, they've sort of led this intense focus on ESG factors and performance. And I'll touch on that a little bit later when I talk through some of the trends we're seeing in the market. But a lot of it's customer driven as well. It's customers saying, I want to own products from companies, or I want to invest in companies where my personal values are aligned with their overall corporate values, or at least are not in direct competition with or not antithetical to those particular values. So back to the question of why should businesses care? I mean, for me, it sort of comes down to risk and opportunity, as Chris was touching on at the beginning, right? If you don't manage ESG risk well, it can be, it could be detrimental to your business. But if on the opportunity side now, and this is increasingly the case, if you do it well, if you're a company that prioritizes ESG in the way in which you deal with all of your stakeholders, it can actually drive value vis-a-vis your competitors. And it really signals to the market, to your investors, that you're not only here today and thinking about these things thoughtfully, but you're in it for the long haul. Your company is looking to drive long-term value in a way that aligns with a sustainable future. And so, those two ways of looking at ESG with risks and opportunities, they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, those companies that focus on the risks will be the most profitable and sustainable over the long term. It's this idea of a triple bottom line, right? Where historically, perhaps companies focused a little bit more on economic viability, but today and going forward, it's not enough just to look at that. It's also about economic and social performance and viability as well. And really the thesis is ESG done well can and ultimately should lead to greater profitability over the long term.
John, that's interesting. You've talked about how companies need to project themselves into the marketplace because investors are interested in that. I mean, your company, your bank is indeed an investor. Are there ways that, a bank, are there concrete examples that you could tell us about how a bank looks at sustainability efforts and, what an organization like yours, and Stephen, maybe you can touch on what we do afterwards, that you're doing in a concrete way?
Yeah, so Chris, BMO touches it as an investor. We touch companies as lenders. We touch them in a variety of different ways. And I think all are really compelling to say, we want to be working with our clients in a way that's, forward-looking, where we can structure products or different solutions that help them meet their sustainability and ultimately their business goals. And so for us at BMO, our purpose is to boldly grow the good in business and in life. And with that, we recently announced a new climate ambition for net zero greenhouse gas emissions, not just operationally for BMO, but across our lending portfolio. So we're talking about working with our clients to try and transition to net zero GHG emissions over the next 30 years. We've stood up a climate institute where, we have engineers and other environmental consultants that are focused on solutions for companies and that'll help companies, our clients, address their climate risks. And, we also announced $1 trillion sustainable finance commitment by 2025. So over the next 4 years, we're really focused on mobilizing capital towards companies that are pursuing sustainable outcomes, as well as managing company and assets under advice in a way that aligns with, a sustainable outcome or responsible investing thesis. From a products perspective, we structure sustainable debt products as an example. So, green, social, sustainability bonds for our clients. Just last week, Bell Canada came to market with a sustainability bond that we helped them bring, put together their framework and bring to market. And then, on the loan side, a bit more of a creative use of sustainable finance and frankly, the traditional loan products is what's called the sustainability linked loan. And just last month, we structured an SLL for Gibson Energy, and it was the first sustainability linked loan for a North American energy company. And the interesting part about this facility was that the interest rate margin that Gibson Energy pays can actually be decreased if they hit certain sustainability targets related to greenhouse gas emissions, but also some social and governance targets related to the diversity within their workplace as well as on their board. And finally, we structured a labeled green loan for a company called Atlantic Packaging earlier this year, where they're using the proceeds 100% for building a 100% recycled containerboard facility in Ontario. And we were able to structure that in a way that aligned with their overall sustainability strategy. So apart from that, we also have an impact fund where we're investing in early stage clean tech companies, scaling them up, and then introducing these companies to our existing corporate clients to solve some of the sustainability challenges that they're facing. And finally, just this week, we announced a new energy transition group with the aim to advise companies across sectors on opportunities related to green technologies introduce them to businesses that can help them solve some of the sustainability challenges they're facing. And so green technologies are things like, hydrogen or electric vehicles or renewable power sources. We want to source these companies that are doing it well, even if they're sort of early stage, and then bring them to our clients that we know are focused on transitioning to green or even frankly less brown activities at some point in the future. And we want to be part of the solution and be at the table to bring these solutions forward. So we have lots going on at BMO, and it certainly aligns with our firm's overall commitment to boldly grow the good in business and life.
This is interesting to me, John, because I've practiced for about 20 years in the debt space, and first of all, to see this much capital focused in one, not one narrow sector, as you said, there's some diverse business names that you had mentioned there. They're not all just in the energy sector, but the goal of those funds, which is an incredible amount of money, is focused with a philosophy behind it, which I think is more than just saying, oh, the real estate sector is going to be hot this year, or the manufacturing sector is going to be hot this year. It's got a real philosophy behind it. And it sounded to me like you were saying that if you do this right, there's actually benefit to the bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. So benefit to the bottom line. I mean, let's be clear, BMO's not doing this for philanthropy. We very much believe that if we can be at the table with solutions for our clients, that sets them up for long-term success. That then allows us to work with them and bank them and grow their businesses and create jobs in the communities over the long term as well. So it's very much looking with an eye to the future, and it's frankly sector agnostic, right? There's no single sector where we're saying you're off limits as a sector, or we're, to your real estate example, we're only focused on you because you seem to be a topical area where people suddenly care about LEED certified buildings, et cetera. It's really across all sectors because every client that we speak to has a sustainability story. Some have already written it and some have written it publicly. Others haven't. And, part of the advisory service and strategic services we can help them with is aligning their strategy, corporate and sustainability strategy, with, what will resonate most with investors and their customers, and then bringing them products that frankly involve us as a bank having skin in the game as well. The Gibson Energy SLL I mentioned, we're talking about a decrease in the interest paid by Gibson if they hit these targets. That impacts our bottom line. But what we've said is, look, over the long term, we want to be banking Gibson into the next 100 years. And so to do that, we need them to align their strategies with a sustainable future. And we want to be part of that solution. And that aligns with our overall net zero commitment as well.
Right, which takes us back to, if a company like that is successful and has more clients because of what they do, it works out on both sides of the equation. Stephen, maybe do you have any thoughts about how does a law firm take on this inside its four walls?
Well, I'll give you a few examples of what we're doing. I'll just give you a peek into things under the S on the social side. Our firm is certified with the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program, which is the world's only corporate responsibility assurance program for Aboriginal relations. We're also a signatory to the Black North Initiative Law Firm Pledge. Our firm is committed to addressing and ending anti-Black and other forms of systemic racism in the legal profession in Canada. We've launched our own reconciliation action plan to help address Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous peoples and to make meaningful contributions to authentic reconciliation efforts. We're formally committed, like many companies and businesses around the world, to the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, as well as supporting the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We're the first international law firm to sign the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, which advances gender equality and promotes women's economic empowerment in their workplaces, in industries and communities. And I've just mentioned as a final note that we're a supporter of the Legal Leaders for Diversity and Inclusion Trust Fund. It offers annual scholarships to young people with disabilities who want to seek a career in law and graduate from Canadian law faculty. So those are a few of the things that a law firm can do. And we're really proud of all the efforts that we make in that area.
Stephen, love all the work that's gone into the S of ESG. Definitely sounds like your firm is well underway to being a trailblazer there. John, you mentioned a little bit about, there are companies who have started the ESG story and some who are maybe not there yet or in the process of starting. So the four of us are lawyers and bankers. How can we help those companies that are just starting there?
Well, I think it's sitting down with them and understanding, well, for one, understanding what their objectives and priorities are. So if it's a company that hasn't started a sustainability strategy, if they don't care about it, then we're not going to try and take the time to convince them that they ought to. This is something that still has to be ingrained in the DNA of an organization. There's very few conversations I have these days where there isn't at least some thought being given to it. And again, often investor driven, but often customer driven as well, where management or C-suite or the board is being engaged directly, by different stakeholders and pressing them to think a little bit more about their strategy or to go a little bit further in some of their public commitments. And so I think for BMO, what we can be doing and Gowlings alongside as well is like, as we're sitting down with these companies, is really encouraging them by pushing them on the areas that matter most to investors. So for example, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, puts out what they call a materiality map. And this map across 70 different sectors identifies the most relevant ES and G issues for different companies as broken down by sector. So what that says to me is, I'll always start with that map and say, okay, if I'm sitting down with a oil and gas company, I know greenhouse gas emissions is going to be relevant. That's going to be an area that investors care deeply about. I know that upstream and downstream, depending on where they are, there's going to be material issues within their supply chain and the transport of their product, all the way through the value chain to end use. I know that, if we think about scope 3 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, how is the oil being burned in whatever the end product is? That's going to be top of mind as well for investors. So then sitting down with the company and trying to help them, either set targets or frankly, bringing them technologies through the energy transition group that I mentioned earlier. If we can bring them the solutions to some of these challenges they're facing, then that's a huge unlock of value for them and can really help them in their sustainability strategy.
And Stephen, I know we work with firms like Gowlings with clients who are interested in ESG and pursuing this further. So curious from your take from a legal perspective, how we can assist these clients.
Well, I think lawyers can help companies deal with ESG factors in a multitude of ways, but let me give you a couple of examples to think about. So ESG reporting. Well, today, as Chris had mentioned, there has not yet been a harmonization of reporting standards and frameworks. And so when you overlay that with mandatory reporting regimes for public companies, it can get very complicated. And as we've seen in examples in the US, where some companies are reporting differently internally than they are externally, it can bring to bear certain legal and regulatory risks. So lawyers can help ensure that the business is reporting in a way that mitigates legal and regulatory risk. And lawyers can help by applying the requisite diligence to ensure that what is being reported is being done in a consistent and accurate manner. And my recommendation to the client is always say what you do, but make sure that you're doing what you say. There shouldn't be any gap between the two of them. Let me give you another example. Lawyers often work with companies at the board level to help develop board skills assessments and develop a board skills matrix. We see now with ESG, we need to ensure that the board has the appropriate critical composition to deal with ESG factors. So not only do boards need a board skill matrix, but they also need to go back and they need to look, and lawyers can help them do that, to do a systematic review of impactful ESG factors in the business and map the landscape of stakeholders and their concerns, and then take that work product and that analysis and then apply it at the board level to ensure that you've got the right combination of skills, expertise, and experience. And so lawyers can really help the board get positioned to appropriately and successfully deal with ESG factors. And as we'll hear, I'll make some comments about a little later. When you don't have that, you're really taking on a lot of governance risk.
That's interesting. I mean, you talked about the board a lot there, Stephen. You know, and I know that obviously American law and Canadian law is not fully aligned, but perhaps the spirits behind them or the philosophy behind them is a little bit aligned. And you know, often we see standards that are American standards drift up here a few years later. Are there differences? Are there factors that we have to think about when we move across border? You know, when we get into large companies and global markets, what's the current state around the world? You know, very roughly speaking, in terms of other markets and how we think about these things.
Well, you know, Chris, that's a great question. And you know, through my work in ESG discussions with lots of companies and lawyers in different jurisdictions, it's like my view is that we have Canadian ESG factors, and those are issues that are bespoke to Canada and unique. And while looking at cross-border things with the US or the EU or other jurisdictions, there's many overlapping issues. There are many that are bespoke to Canadian businesses, and I think investors and other stakeholders are well aware of them. So let me give you some examples. So Canada's Indigenous peoples, they are stakeholders, but they're stakeholders with constitutionally protected rights, and that is very unique to Canada. Canada's an Arctic nation, and we have social justice issues in the Arctic, as well as environmental issues that are exacerbated by climate change. And you won't see that in many jurisdictions. And so you need to be aware of it if you're doing business or investing in Arctic projects, for example, or companies that are doing business in the Arctic. Human capital management in Canada. Canadian workplace laws are fundamentally different from those in the United States. And in looking at social, under the ESG, looking at social factors, need to be aware of that. And speaking of the US, we share our border with our biggest trading and investment partner. Let's look at the ESG. So under the E, we have very different environmental laws and regulations, very different approval mechanisms and processes for major projects in Canada, for example. Under the S, we have many similar social and social justice issues, but we also have many that are bespoke to Canada. For example, in Canada's Indigenous peoples that I mentioned, French language rights in Quebec are unique to Canada and need to be considered when you're talking about the S in ESG in Canada. And G for governance. Corporate governance in Canada and the US are still not on the same page. In the US, the law of the land is still shareholder primacy. And that means that the corporation exists for the benefit primarily of the shareholders. Whereas in Canada, it's much different. The Supreme Court of Canada many years ago said it's okay to consider the interests of stakeholders when directors are involved in their decision-making process. And shareholders are only one stakeholder amongst the groups that we discussed before. In the US, we see organizations like the Business Roundtable coming forward and promoting corporate purpose as something that businesses should be focused on. And corporate purpose really means taking into account the interests of stakeholders. So in Canada and the US, we're not quite there in terms of alignment of corporate governance. So I guess what I would say, the takeaway is there's a lot of overlap, but I think people looking at ESG need to be mindful of the differences and pay particular attention to those ESG factors that are unique to Canada.
Interesting. Is that true, John, as well in the debt and equity markets? Is there overlap? Are there differences? Or are we seeing large institutions take a global view to these things?
Well, I would say that North America is a little more in sync as it relates to sustainable debt, sustainable equity markets. Europe has always been just a little bit ahead of where we are in North America. And it's been, as I've alluded to a couple of times, sort of investor driven to date, where a number of the large asset managers in Europe or investors in Europe have sort of a more refined or defined green social sustainability mandate and are making purchasing decisions accordingly now. Part of it is in Europe, there's regulatory backing. So the various governments, and in particularly the EU with the Green Deal in the EU now, there is regulatory backing to say that it's one thing for investors, but companies actually ought to have net zero alignment by 2050. They ought to be focused on the ESG of their performance. And if they're not, then they're now in regulatory breach, as opposed to simply falling out of favor with investors. But just moving back to North America for a second, I mean, the sustainable debt market here is on fire, right? And so last year alone, we saw 700 billion in sustainable debt issued. So that's, green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, which are essentially a combination of green and social projects. Historically, green bonds have been sort of the lion's share of the sustainable debt products that we've seen come to market by a variety of issuers, development banks, corporates, insurance companies, financial institutions, utilities, virtually all sectors. But interestingly, over the last year and a half, we're starting to see that proportion of green bonds, is that overall 700 billion proportion I mentioned in 2020, it's shrinking. And what's growing in its place are social bonds, for example. So last year, we saw Pfizer come to market with $1 billion social bond with proceeds used to fund vaccination research. And I'm happy they did, because I got my Pfizer shot recently. We also saw Alphabet come to market with a $6.5 billion sustainability bond, but part of the proceeds used in that bond were to support, the BIPOC community and to invest in businesses owned by BIPOC individuals. That's a fantastic use of the sustainable debt market, but it falls in the social bond category that we're starting to see more and more of. And then increasingly, we're seeing sustainability linked loans. And I mentioned the Gibson example. In fact, in this year, in the first 4 months of 2021, we've seen $100 billion worth of sustainability linked loans. And then we've started to see them branching into bonds as well. So sustainability linked bonds are the same thing as an SLL, is the same thing as a loan, but on the bond side, where the coupon can actually step up, the coupon payable by the issuer can actually step up and increase if the issuer doesn't achieve certain predetermined sustainability targets. So we saw the first SLB in the US in November of last year, the company called Energy, and we were a book runner on that transaction. We recently were involved in one with a poultry producer in the US as well, called Pilgrim's Pride. I think sustainability linked bonds are an area to keep your eye on. I expect we'll see over the next 8 months of this year a number of sustainability linked bonds come to market in North America, and fingers crossed in Canada as well. And what makes them unique is they're open virtually to any issuer that's made a realistic commitment to some sort of sustainability improvement. Whereas green bonds, you sort of have to have, call it $500 million worth of green proceeds and green projects to finance. With sustainability linked, it's a general corporate purpose facility or bond, but you ought to use the proceeds towards the particular KPIs that you've set along with the structuring agents that you've worked with. So I think that'll be a really catalyzing type of asset class that we'll see here through the rest of 2021. And then on the equity side, I mean, 2020 was booming again. We saw 223% growth in ESG themed ETFs specifically. So a lot of people pulling money out of sort of vanilla or regular or ETFs and mutual funds and pouring it into ESG themed funds, which can range anywhere from excluding certain sectors that are not green in nature, or all the way through to sort of best in class performers in different sectors, or even impact themed investments where you're investing in companies that are doing really good environmentally or socially in the communities. And we saw great performance as well from these ESG themed ETFs, and I expect through 2021 we'll continue to see growth in this sector. Now, I can say that confidently because it really is investor driven, both on the fixed income or debt side, as well as on the equity side. Climate change is actually the #1 issue for asset managers in the US right now. And $51 trillion AUM is currently invested through a responsible investing lens globally. So 51 trillion AUM invested under a responsible investing lens globally. And recently there's been asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and others managing more than 22 trillion of assets that have committed to aligning their portfolios with net zero emissions by 2050. So looking at their investee companies and saying, we want to align our portfolios with net zero, I think this is going to be a huge catalyst for the market. And this has all been sort of in the last year or two that we've seen significant growth. And then finally, on the corporate side, there's over 1,500 companies now that have publicly committed or announced plans to be net zero by 2050 or sooner, which is in alignment with the Paris Climate Accord. So 1,500 companies is significant. It's actually a 300% growth since 2019. So companies are recognizing the importance as well, probably because investors are telling them, but it's a good flywheel to be spinning right now. And I think it's only going to continue to grow the ESG debt and equity market into the future.
Along those lines, we do have a question from the audience actually, and just a reminder for everybody, if you do want to ask a question to the panel, use the Q&A feature. How can companies use ESG to drive profitability and ROI, and where do you see the growth opportunities? Maybe I'll start with you, John, since we just chatted on the topic.
This is my favorite topic because at the end of the day, why else are we talking to our clients if it's not to drive ROI, but to do it responsibly and sustainably, right? And so, the one is obviously, I've mentioned it, but you have lenders that are tying cost of capital to sustainability strategy and improvement. So the SLL example. So for one, if I'm a company and I'm looking to drive profitability, that includes lowering the interest I pay on facilities. Similarly, in the bond market, we are seeing bonds pricing tighter if they have a ESG or green label to them. And that's in part because the investors I mentioned earlier, some of them have specific green buying mandates. So a percentage of the portfolio has to be in green, social, or sustainable, or ESG. But at the very least, the vast majority of investors are UNPRI aligned. So the principles for responsible investing aligned, which at the very bare minimum requires them to incorporate ESG and integrate ESG into their investment decision-making. And finally, customers, right? So customers are so focused on ESG and aligning their purchasing decisions that inevitably a company is only going to grow if nothing else they are focused on ESG risk and building out their strategy as it relates to this sector. And we're in the midst of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history, with baby boomers transferring money to millennials and to Gen Zers. And it's the millennials and Gen Zers that are increasingly investing and making purchasing decisions into companies that they believe in, that they align some sort of their personal values with, or at the very least, they're not opposite their values. And so I think we're going to see continued growth. And from an ROI driver perspective, unquestionably, this is going to be a driver for businesses because customers and investors care. And those are probably, arguably, two of the most important stakeholders.
Yeah, I hear, John, you say a number of things about sustainability and the environment, but we've talked about some of the other items that fall into ESG. And Stephen, one of the items is supply chain. The supply chain obviously is important to ROI for a company, right? The cheaper you can get your supply chain, the better, because that increases your profit margin. Do you think that ESG supply chain issues are gonna, perhaps if the environment is up here and reducing, greenhouse gases up here is on the scale of important things to do you think that the supply chain issues are going to become more important and more important to Canadian companies?
I certainly do, Chris. Let me take a step back and provide a little context in terms of supply chain issues relating to ESG. According to a World Vision Canada report, about $34 billion a year of goods that are at high risk of having been made with forced labor or child labor are imported into Canada. And this issue has attracted a lot of attention, as John said, from consumers and investors and legislators. We've seen lots of litigation in the US especially on the consumer side, from consumers who said, I didn't want to bring forced labor or child labor made goods into my house and serve this to my family for dinner. So, but that's just one example. In Canada, why it's becoming even more important, not just consumers and investors, is from a legislative and regulatory perspective. As you know, last July, the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, came into force. And accordingly, under the provisions of USMCA, Canada then implemented it. And one of the ways it was implemented was through amendments to the Tariff Act and the customs tariff with Canada. And what they did was banned the import of goods produced in whole or in part with forced labor, including forced child labor. So those goods could no longer come into Canada. So what that meant was that from a supply chain perspective, Canadian businesses who were importing these goods, allegedly $34 billion a year, had to look at their supply chain, conduct due diligence, develop policies and procedures and contracts to ensure that they're in compliance with applicable Canadian law. I'm sure that every one of the loan agreements or debt agreements that you work on says that the borrower or the debtor has to be in compliance with applicable Canadian law. And so the law changed on July 1. And right now, Canada's investigating, the federal government's investigating importation of solar panels, of rubber gloves, of palm oil, of different products that are alleged to have been made with forced labor outside of Canada. The second reason from a regulatory perspective is something called Bill S-216. This is Canada's proposed modern slavery disclosure legislation. It passed second reading in the Senate and was referred to the Standing Committee of the Senate on banking, trading, commerce, where it's being studied. This law would require Canadian companies that were meet the revenue threshold or the employee threshold, number of employees, require them to report annually on steps taken to prevent or reduce the risk that there's forced labor or child labor used anywhere in their supply chain in terms of the goods that they make or the goods they import into Canada. They also have to report on corporate structure, on policies they have to deal with forced labor and child labor, and a number of other things. So this, from a regulatory perspective, it's becoming even more important. And for Canadian companies that do business in the U.S., the U.S. Forced labor goods have been banned from importation since 2016 under President Obama. But the Customs and Border Protection in the U.S. are very aggressive in issuing withhold release orders to seize suspected forced labor goods at the border and then put the onus on the importer to prove that they're not made with forced labor anywhere in their supply chain. So the other thing in the US for Canadian companies that want to supply goods or services to the US government, the Federal Acquisition Regulation prohibits federal contractors and subcontractors from using forced labor or human traffic labor in the provision of any goods or services to the US federal government, which is the biggest consumer in the world. So what we see for Canadian companies now in terms of supply chain from the ESG perspective is not only on the environmental side, but on the social side, these changes in consumer perspectives and definitely investors who are trying to manage investment risk, and also from legislators who want to ensure that human rights are properly dealt with, are now putting pressure on Canadian businesses to step up to the plate.
Sorry, if I could
John,
just
if I can just interrupt for a sec, John, I'll let you jump in, but we have a question from the audience that you know, Stephen, you mentioned rubber gloves, and John, you mentioned the Pfizer vaccine, and Stephen, you mentioned USMCA, which happened before COVID, but then I guess has been more implemented, and the transition has started during COVID. We have a question from the audience as to how COVID-19 may have impacted, you know, the development of ESG or delayed it, and you know, maybe they give you a double-barrel question. I'll let you talk about supply chain and whether or not you have thoughts about how COVID-19 was an impact. Obviously, it affected supply chains.
Well, let me just address it briefly from the social side, just moving away from the supply chain for just 1 second, which is the first thing that we all heard and welcomed when the pandemic broke was employers and businesses around the world saying, we're all in this together. Our top priority is the health and safety of our employees. And so immediately there was a different lens, a cast upon employer-employee relationships in terms of, and that falls under the S in terms of social human capital management. And I think that's fundamentally changed in my view, the employer-employee relationship in terms of more collaboration and more opportunities for support, both from medical side, and from the mental health perspective.
Yeah, my comment was going to be call Stephen if you have any questions about your supply chain or some of the risks facing the businesses. But maybe this is my point to be on it is, through COVID, what we saw was an increased focus on supply chains. And, in particular, if I think about it, in Canada, at one point we had 3 of the 4 major meat processing plants were shut down because there were breakouts within the facilities. And that could have caused serious disruption to, food on the shelves in our grocery stores, et cetera. We managed to skirt it a little bit to an extent. There was some shortages here and there, but if you think about the interconnectivity of supply chains and how so much inventory is sort of just in time and first in, first out, et cetera, it can be a real shock to the system if there are major supply chain risks, which of course fall under the S or social risk within ES&G. On the positive side, to the employee, the focus on employees Stephen is referring to, we had, grocers like Sobeys who implemented a hero pay program, acknowledging that their employees, their frontline workers, they were putting their health and safety in jeopardy every day. And Loblaws, noted a similar program. And so that was, which, involved additional pay for them. And so that was a really good program, but truly putting your money where your mouth is and putting in the safeguards and whatnot to keep your employees safe, which there was such a focus on that, if you didn't do it well, and there's some companies, I'd rather not name them specifically, but maybe the most valuable company in the US right now that through its grocer chain didn't do it very well. And suddenly you have these horror stories of individuals in their facilities who got sick from COVID and then had to, borrow vacation days from other employees or ones that were fired because they got COVID. You hear these stories and inevitably these things stick, especially in customers' minds, to say, next time I go to make a purchase decision, I'm going to think twice about that. The last point I want to make around the supply chain is, we have companies like Walmart that are they've set up a sustainable supply chain finance program where basically they looked across their spectrum of 600,000, probably way more now, but this was a few years ago, suppliers, and said, we're going to put you into individual groupings based on the items you supply. So if you all the way down to apples or oranges or, rubber gloves as an example, and we're going to put you as the 5 suppliers of rubber gloves into a quadrant and say, those that perform best, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a social and governance perspective as well. We're going to take the time to evaluate you, and we're going to work with a third party called EcoVadis in doing so. But we're going to sit down, and if you do well, then we are actually going to incentivize you by giving you better financing terms. If you do less well or poorly, and there's 5 suppliers, you're in the bottom quadrant, you're going to get worse financing terms. And so for Walmart, it made a lot of sense because one, they had the purchasing power that they could sort of push down the sustainability measures and embed them into their suppliers' overall businesses. But it also made sense because Walmart had made very public commitments of scope 1, 2, and 3, and its overall ESG performance across its supply chain. But then the third area where it makes sense is just from a credit risk perspective. I mean, the companies that are at least focused on their own ESG performance are more creditworthy, all things equal. And Walmart acknowledged that and said, look, we want to be working with those clients because they're least likely to default or disappear or not deliver in time, et cetera, because they're well-managed companies that clearly are prioritizing ESG. So, back to the COVID question, I was happy that people in LA could see downtown, people could see the Himalayas. There were dolphins swimming in Italy. That was all really good from an environmental perspective. But I think, it became really clear from a social perspective, the winners and losers as it relates to supply chains and the way they treat employees.
So we do have another question from the audience, and maybe I'll start with you, Stephen, on this one. Given there is a roadmap of looking to Europe, where many companies have already put into place global policies that tackle these issues, do you anticipate Canadian companies complying before the laws come into effect? And would complying early be a way to differentiate yourself?
Well, I would say that so first of all, there are a number of Canadian companies already that operate in different jurisdictions and have, with respect to those operations, have to comply with the legislation in those jurisdictions. So one example would be the UK Modern Slavery Act, where businesses that are operating in the UK and are of the requisite size to be subject to the act are filing those reports. And so talking about the modern slavery, which is forced labor, human traffic labor, indentured labor, child labor in their supply chain. So they're already reporting, going beyond what's required in Canada. With respect to modern due diligence or modern slavery and mandatory due diligence legislation in the EU, I'm not sure that companies are necessarily complying with legislation before it's in place, but there are many companies that are already doing the work. They're already doing the due diligence. And so what they want is they want to have a level playing field. We say, like, we're doing the work already on a voluntary basis. We're doing the due diligence. We're ensuring that our supply chain, there aren't human rights abuses occurring in our supply chain or adverse impacts on human rights. We're already doing that. We don't need legislation to tell us to do that. And so the legislation sort of comes in to really capture, if you will, or deal with companies that aren't willing to do it on a voluntary basis.
I know you're addressing a lot of this in your upcoming book, so congratulations. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a couple of companies who may need assistance with navigating through all the complexities of supply chain. There's obviously the consumer, there's government, there's international law too. And so curious to get your advice on how you can help these companies navigate through all of this.
Well, it's a challenge, and obviously in every jurisdiction there's different legislation, but from my perspective, I like to start with at the very top, at the board level. I've provided education at the board level, and essentially the first step in my recommendation is always to adopt a governing principle in terms of your business's position with respect to human rights in a supply chain. So for example, it could be something as simple as our business does not tolerate or use forced labor or child labor in our operations or a supply chain. So once a business adopts a governing principle like that and takes the position that's very clear in terms of from the top how this business is going to operate, then the question is, okay, how do we operationalize that? The next step being conducting due diligence, supplier mapping, supply chain mapping to understand, okay, where on a risk management basis, where are the greatest risks in our business and supply chain. And then as a third step, then to try and operationalize it in terms of putting in place the policies, the processes, the communication and training for employees and suppliers, the necessary codes of conduct and supplier responsibility standards. And then finally, remediation, because businesses also have to take responsibility for the adverse effects and adverse impacts on human rights that occur within their supply chain. That's in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So really, there is a structure that to be followed, but it all starts at the top with sort of that binary decision, which is, so are we for it or against it?
interesting. You know, you touched on something there, and we're coming up at the end of our hour, Stephen. So I invite any of our audience members who want to jump in with a question to get in now, and we'll try to close off close to the top of the hour, because I know everybody's busy. But you mentioned a number of things there, and I wonder if John and Stephen, you could talk a little bit, just, you know, what do you think are the up and coming critical issues for business that are going to show up for ESG going forward?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and I'm going to give a little, give props to Gowlings and BMO for this first one, but around disclosure, right? And so how are you disclosing ESG risk? How are you disclosing your overall performance? We're seeing investors like BlackRock and others that are pressing their investee companies to align with SASB, which I mentioned earlier, the Global Reporting Initiative, or even the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. You know, even last year, we saw the government of Canada tie some of its bailout funding to companies committing to TCFD reporting. And so that level of disclosure, which in that case requires like scenario analysis in a 1.5 and 3 degree scenario, that's not easy for companies to do, but I think it's something that is going to be increasingly come under the microscope for all stakeholders. Secondly, I would say executive comp tied to ESG performance. That seems to be one we're hearing from a lot of investors on right now. All of the major banks have committed to tying in some capacity comp to ESG. It's harder for other companies and other sectors, but nevertheless, investors are still calling for it. And then finally, around transition finance. I've mentioned our energy transition group earlier, but you know, how can we get capital to these companies that are committed to being sustainable and being, you know, less brown in the future, but need the capital to allocate towards projects which will materially allow them to reduce their GHG emissions? You know, we're a resource intensive economy here in Canada, and our clients are the first ones that put their hand up and say, we are committed to what, you know, the future holds. We want to transition our business. For BMO, it's important that we're at the table, because if we're not, it's going to be another bank, maybe a non-Canadian, maybe non-North American lender, but nevertheless, it'll be someone else. And we've taken the approach of, we want to be at the table to bring those solutions forward, and doing that through the Energy Transition Group.
Wow. I agree with John absolutely on all of those things. Let me add a couple quick ones. One, activist investors and their supporters like asset managers and pension funds. I'm going to see much more pressure on boards. We saw it last week at with ExxonMobil, where engine number one is, I believe it's now got 3 seats on the board. So activist investors. Number 2, climate change litigation. Last week in the Netherlands, Royal Dutch Shell was ordered to reduce carbon emissions by 45% compared to 2019 levels. And although apparently that's going to be appealed, there's about 1,800 climate change lawsuits going on around the world, according to a database that I looked at this morning, including 25 in Canada. We're going to see more litigation. We're going to see litigation, according to the experts, in the US, where fiduciary duty of directors meets climate change, and on the governance side. And then the last point that I'll make is just, I mentioned a couple things earlier, but it's an increased regulatory burden on businesses to deal with environmental issues, deal with human rights issues, and deal with governance. And we'll see that in Canada, but also especially in the EU. Back to you, Chris.
John and Stephen, this was great, and for all of your expertise today. I think we've all learned a lot, and I'm sure this will not be the last conversation as we continue to head towards the ESG path for many companies. Thank you for Gowlings for hosting us today. There will be a recording of this for anyone who is interested in sharing it with someone else, or if you've missed it. And as well, we will circulate some information for the panel if you do have any additional questions. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.